and exclusion through the teaching and learning.
I think Laraib is... Uh-oh.
Okay, can everyone hear me? Because my internet connection is a little bad. Should I introduce myself again?
Yes, please, to everybody.
Okay. My name is Laraib Niaz. I'm a fourth-year PhD candidate in education at the Institute of Education, University College London. I'm looking at, very broadly speaking, the involvement of religion in education in Pakistan at the classroom level. So there's been a lot of research at the textbook level, which we will be discussing in this seminar. But there's hardly been any research on what's happening in the classrooms and how those textbooks are enacted in classrooms and how they turn into pedagogy. So that's what I'm observing using qualitative case studies with ethnographic methods. I previously completed a master's in development management from the LSE. I have been working as an education consultant. I'm also teaching at UCL. And I wanted to mention that my supervisors are Professor Mari Lal, who along with the esteemed panelists here, I'm repeating the exact same things, who along with the esteemed panelists here have really informed my thinking on otherism, on identity construction, on citizenship, and on the involvement of religion in education. And my second supervisor is Dr. Fareed Panjwani, who I think is also attending the webinar. So I'm really, really honored to be a part of this panel and to be moderating this session on a very, very imperative and pertinent topic. So thank you, Anya, for involving me in this.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for making time. I think your research is very, very beautifully aligned. So with so much discourse that has been taking place on the upcoming single national curriculum, I feel it only felt natural to start to look at what is the influence of this curriculum, of these textbooks on students? And also through a lot of conversations that I was having and some of my peers were having, Pakistan witnesses consistently high rates of discrimination against minority groups. So that can include Hindus, that can include Christians. We are frequently reading about devastation that is taking place to them. Some of our own students actually will talk about how they are protected or they're saved because they're Muslim, whereas their Hindu colleagues or Hindu peers are the ones that will probably have to face the wrath of COVID. So at a systemic level, as well as at a very personal level, there are ample examples. I mean, there's just countless in terms of how we are learning to not be embracing all, but to be embracing the idea of individualism. And as we talk so much about the single national curriculum, we thought it was our responsibility to bring the conversation to, well, there will be a curriculum, but what role does it play in enabling us to be constructive, progressive members of society? Which is why we began to plan this webinar. I know that our esteemed panelists have introduced themselves, but I will just do a quick short introduction of each of them. So as we now have with us Dr. Rubina Saigol. She is currently an independent researcher. She's based in Lahore. Dr. Saigol received a PhD in Education and Development from the University of Rochester and her MA in Development Psychology from Columbia. She has authored and edited several books and papers in both English and in Urdu. And her research interests include the state, ethnicity, feminism, and human rights. And some of her publications focus on feminist perspectives on nation and identity. And she's widely published internationally. Next, I would like to introduce Zubedia Mustafa. She is a freelance journalist who writes fortnightly for Dawn. She has been with them since 1975. In fact, she launched and edited Dawn's health page, their book page, their education page, their career-wise Encounter, Karachi Notebook, and most notably, their books and authors section, which was the first book magazine brought out by any newspaper in Pakistan. Before she actually entered the world of journalism, she also worked at the Pakistan Institute of International Affairs as a research officer. She has compiled and edited a number of books, and as she just mentioned, she has an upcoming book coming that will be exploring language and the need to reform the education system in Pakistan. Great. Next, I would like to introduce Dr. Naureen Durrani. She is a professor and research chair in the Graduate School of Education in Nazarbayev University. So she's based in Kazakhstan. And before joining NU, she was actually at the Center for International Education at the University of Sussex. He has also held research and teaching positions at Northumbria University, the University of Central Lancashire, and the University of Peshawar. Her research interests include outcomes of education on identity formation and social relations. And unsurprisingly, she is also very, very widely published internationally. Last but not least, we have with us Camilla Chaudhary. Other than also being a very dear friend, she is a PhD candidate at the Faculty of Education at the University of Cambridge. And her research interests include equity and inclusion in education in low resource contexts. She also is interested in teacher and student agency and empathetic pedagogy. The focus of her PhD is on how inclusion is conceptualized in the Global South with a contextual focus on Pakistan. So as you can imagine, we have absolutely the right people here to have this conversation and to learn from. Just quickly in terms of the structure, we have 2 to 3 questions for each panelist that Laraib and I will alternate to pose, after which we'll have about 15 to 20 minutes for Q&A, and then we'll close off. If you have any questions throughout the session, please post them in the Q&A box, and we welcome all the attendees and the panelists to engage using chat as well. With that, we can begin. Laraib, I'll turn to you to introduce otherism as a concept and as a notion to set the scene.
Thank you again, Anya, for such a lovely introduction of everyone and the panel. But I did think that before we do start, it is important to kind of speak about the term itself, otherism, and the purpose of this very important webinar. Now, otherism in itself is a very funny term, and it's not oft used. So I just thought that I would give some background to it. Very simply put, otherism is the exclusion of a person based on their perceived divergence from an acceptable norm. Now, that norm can be constructed on any basis, on any line. And those lines are the ones that we will be talking about today. How is that linked to identity? It's linked to identity because identity is always constituted in relation to difference, because a thing can only be known in relation to what it's not. It may sound complicated, but the whole idea is when constructing identity, we often think about what our identity isn't. And in thinking of that, we construct the others. The education comes in here because education is often used to construct these others. You look at yourself, you decide who you are, but you also think about who you're not, and you think about the others. Why is this imperative for a country like Pakistan? We are a nation, as Anya, we have spoken about this, and there's a lot of discussion around it, but we really are a nation that is marred with systemic and societal exclusion and prejudice by citizens and towards citizens on every line imaginable. These lines include religious, ethnic, class, sectarian, linguistic, and gender lines. So this really begs the question, and this is something that Camilla, Anya, and I have been discussing, that how does the average citizen become so parochial and so exclusionary in his outlook towards the self and towards the other? And surely we know that the complex process of identity formation begins at home. But it is inevitable. The influence of the schooling conditions on the identity of students, of individuals, is also inevitable, because these are the official sites where the socialization of human beings, the socialization of students and children takes place. And that is why education is important in constructing these others. Again, why are we focusing on textbooks? Because the predominant pedagogical style in Pakistan places an emphasis on rote memorization from textbooks, from reading passages from textbooks in the classrooms without there being any scope or any space for critical thinking, for critical questioning. So because the pedagogical style focuses so much on textbooks, looking at textbooks for their inherent meanings, their construction, the way they help in constructing the identity of students becomes a very important exercise in determining how that actually takes place. So this webinar is actually very pertinent right now, because as Anya mentioned, there has been a lot of debate on the single national curriculum. There has been a lot of debate on particularly on the inclusion of religion in the single national curriculum. But there's hardly been any discussion or debate on the fact that why is this problematic? Why is this overwhelming focus on a particular ideology, religion, culture, gender is problematic? Why is it exclusionary? It is exclusionary because that makes the lens with which you view the world, and in this particularly, I'm speaking about a student, the way a student views the world, exclusionary and parochial. And this is something that happens so implicitly, and it is so embedded in the education system that in the mainstream narrative, this is hardly spoken about. And so the esteemed panelists here can shed some light on this, and they have done research on this, on identity, on citizenship, on the construction of that other. How does the Pakistani citizen, the student, view himself through the textbooks and views the other through the textbook? And that brings to the fore the most important question: how does the other become a threat? How does any sort of difference and divergence becomes a threat? And that is the whole point of today's webinar, where we want to see the implicit and embedded ways in which this othering is happening. And so we have divided today's webinar into 3 themes. The first theme is othering and gender. The second is othering and language. The third is othering and religion. So I'm going to hand it back to Anya, who's going to start with the first theme, which is othering and gender. So we're going to look at how this othering is happening through gender. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Laraib. That was actually really, really well put. These ideas of exclusion are, it's very alarming, but it's also so concerning at a personal level, because you see these behaviors are not just what others are exhibiting, but sometimes yourself as well, because of our participation in these types of schooling systems. So thank you very much for that. Dr. Naureen Durrani, I'll actually turn to you with a couple of questions on otherism through gender. So my first question to you is, how is gender represented in textbooks?
So, like Laraib, it's good first to engage with the concept of gender itself, and then we'll move to the ways it's represented in textbooks. Gender is constructed through a binary as well, and it's the most widely accepted understanding of gender as the binary between male and female, where female is contrasted and with male, and then she becomes the other. However, what I'm saying is gender is not something that we own or have. It's not about our body. Gender is something that we do and enact within the discursive conventions of particular social and cultural contexts. Why gender becomes so naturalized? It assumes its naturalness because of continued affirmation of our gender enactment according to cultural definitions of masculinity and femininity. Another thing that is integral to the constitution of gender, as well as involved in otherism, is power. Power is a pervasive regulatory system for social control in which all individuals, males and females, subordinated and oppressed, as well as the ones who dominate, they all participate in this system, regulatory system of power, and all institutions as well, including the family that you mentioned, Laraib, including education, including the military, the workspace, etc., etc. But the most important thing is gender is intersected by other markers of identity. What I'm saying is that this indicates that the normative framing of gender is contingent and it's shifting. We cannot have one understanding or framing of gender. Laraib talked about othering, and again, in relation to that, it's the hierarchy is very important. So in that relationship, someone is up there, whereas others are contrasted with that ideal image, and then they become the other. So in the case of gender, the ideal position is the hegemonic masculinity, And the hegemonic masculinity is then used to exclude other subordinated masculinities. Masculinities and femininities come in different forms, and both femininities and subordinated masculinities become excluded. The fourth point I wanted to highlight, which is pertinent to Pakistan, is the significance of women to national identities and national imaginaries. It is very significant in all contexts, but particularly in post-colonial contexts like Pakistan, women become the symbolic markers of the nation's identity. They reproduce the nation biologically, culturally they reproduce the nation by upbringing and imparting the cultural values as well as the gender norms to the next generation. And in that sense, in the post-colonial women, they are under surveillance and regulation, both externally and internally. Externally, they need to be rescued from their men, even if it means conflict and violence. So was the case in Afghanistan for the liberation of Afghan women. Afghanis are still paying a heavy price for the liberation of women. So that's important. And the second point is, then what it does, internally women have to be regulated, both by their men and women, but through intersecting kinship norms, gender norms, religious norms. So a lot of pressure on women to perform and enact gender in the right way. And if they fail to do, then the consequences are high. It can be discursive exclusion, but more often than not, it's quite violent, direct physical violence directed against women. So now moving to your question about how gender is represented. Again, it's not just the example of Pakistan. I've been looking at the relationship between gender and textbook discourse in a number of countries. So Pakistan is no exclusion, but some countries have high levels of othering. Other countries like Pakistan has greater levels of othering. So we tend to see from my ongoing work that boys and men, they get more visibility, both in text and in visuals. As I argued, the knowledge is constructed in textbooks and curricular contents. They constitute the gender order by the ways textbooks promote particular kind of masculinity, or what is the hegemonic masculinity in Pakistani textbooks. This hegemonic masculinity is constructed through the feminine. So the motherland, the Pakistani nation, the Islamic nation is portrayed as continuously under threat from antagonistic non-Muslim external others. And then the hegemonic masculinity becomes the protector of both the ideological as well as the territorial boundaries of the nation. So textbooks, national icons within textbooks are more often than not males who are not afraid to dominate and overpower others, even if it comes at the expense of their own lives, so the shaheeds and their valorization. And then once you allocate that particular responsibility to protect, then it extends to the protection of women. Women have to be protected. That's why, in a way, the violence against women that we see, it comes from that kind of protection. Women, on the other hand, they are less visible on the whole, but where they are visible in the domestic sphere, not in the public sphere where men are represented and portrayed. And even when a couple of minority women do appear in national textbooks as national icons, what they are valorized is for their nurturing and caring responsibilities rather than being praised for whatever they have done. So we see, this is the ways that textbooks tend to create gender, constitute gender through the use of power, and that creates othering. Effeminate men and women became the other, whereas the protector becomes the hegemonic masculinity.
Mm-hmm. Wow, there's a lot to chew on that. I feel that we could just have several hours of teasing out what you've mentioned. Thank you for that. My next question to you then is that are these textbooks made, in your opinion, then for a girl audience, for a boy audience, or are they gender neutral? Because I mean, it sounds like they're not, but it would be interesting to hear what you think in terms of how the content is relayed. Who is it really for?
So the content is the citizen in waiting. The aim is to learn how to become a citizen, and it is targeted both at boys, young boys, and young girls, so that they learn their rightful place in society. I talked earlier about power, and power, when I say it's pervasive and everyone participates in it, it means that power not only works through imposition, but it works discursively by enabling us to attach our feelings and emotions to particular identity positions, so that we then do not need any external surveillance. We start regulating ourselves. And that's the power of the textbook, which is an official discourse. That's what the nation has legitimized. And young girls and young boys, they both learn from the textbooks as well as from the classroom interactions and what goes on outside as well. They develop particular identifications. They are encouraged to attach themselves to the idealized gender positions and other gender positions which are excluded from the textbook. The consequence is that either people will not develop attachment to those subject positions, or if they develop, then they will be regulated by their peers or by the teachers, and in that way, they'll be punished for transgressing the gender norms.
Again, okay, thank you so much. That's such an important perspective to hold. And also, in a sense, I find that it sets you free. It sets you free from consistently holding yourself accountable. For an example, as a woman, to host such ideals of your identity as well as men. It sets you free because somehow you can place a little bit of that burden on the perpetuation of this gendered otherness through your schooling experience. And I think that when you actually go to that root, well, it's not the root cause because that's further down the line, but if you can actually take that burden and position it a little bit outside of yourself of why you perceive identities in a certain way, then you can begin to dissect it in a healthier way, I think. Great. Thank you. Sorry, please carry on.
No, that's okay. I was saying, yes, that's the first step in order to deconstruct the naturalized ways of doing gender. When you find a disconnect between what gender positions you have held on to and your own interests and desires in life. So that's the starting point.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Dr. Naureen. Durrani, that was brilliant. And as you can probably see from chat as well, I think that the attendees are finding that this resonates across borders. We have Vandana Singh here, who's also looking at primary school pupils developing their gendered capabilities in neighboring India. So you're right that these lessons are not just reserved for the Pakistani context. In fact, we are one country amongst several that have this sort of troubled and complex relationship, especially with how we might step away from doing this. So thank you again. And actually with that, I'll turn my attention to you, Zubeida Appa, which is to talk about otherism through language. And this section is specifically has personal significance for me, because I developed the Citizens Foundation, TCF's first English as a foreign language curriculum. And it was startling for me to have to see that even if an entire household could speak 5 words of English, they were adamant to have English as the medium of instruction, and to even introduce it as a foreign language made them very uncomfortable. So with that, can you hear me actually, Zubeida? I just want to be sure.
Yes, I can, Anya.
Great. So my question to you is then, how is the use of English as the medium of instruction perpetuating otherism?
Well, actually, you see, I feel that educationists here, and through them, the public, they do not even understand the importance of language, whatever language it might be. They treat it like a skill which you have to acquire, like any other skill. And even in education, where language is very important, it's all right if you are learning the computer, you may not even be able to read something, but you know where you take the cursor, what you do, or anything. But to understand anything, you have to speak a language, know a language. And that is something which is not at all understood here. People don't even give it any importance. And they just think, of course, you can choose any language, because when you are teaching a child, so whichever language you teach the child will learn it. The child will also learn whatever the subject is. But that is not a fact. You see, like you speak about identity. Now that identity of the child is formed through language, which is the first thing. And why the mother tongue is given so much importance, because that is what the child is first exposed to. And a little bit about how a child acquires language. Because if you think of it, that language is not taught. Why is it that there are so many people in our country, especially, there are millions and millions, not just children, even adults, who are uneducated, who are illiterate, but they all have a language. I mean, this is something which I think it doesn't strike anyone, that you don't teach language to a child. The child just learns it or acquires it. That's the term which many linguists use, because they think that it is something which comes very naturally. If you are living in a human society, there have been cases of children being taken away by wolves and all, but then because they did not hear any human sound, any human voices, any human language, that is why they couldn't. And when they were later brought out, it was more or less impossible to teach them any language, because it's all a part of the process of growing up. And the other thing which we fail to understand is, and realize, and that is why our education system is going to the dog, is that the process the child acquires language, that is something also important, because it's something very natural. It comes very naturally, first because the child is hearing the language, and it is generally in the household, and it's generally the mother, but even others, whatever language they are speaking. So that is the language it acquires. And every child is born, you can say, like a clean slate. The child in Japan will learn Japanese. The child in, say, Karachi, if he comes from a Sindhi-speaking family, will speak Sindhi. So that is something. And then what we do is that later on, what I would say, when I say we, I would say the educationists, because we seem to know that we know it all. कि अब हम इसको ये सिखाएंगे, and then it all starts. But what you should remember, that the child has already learned many things by the time the child comes to school. So in effect, and many things come very naturally to him or her. And with education, the very important thing which is growing is his cognition. He's learning to understand, to think, and many other very basic qualities which a child is born with is like curiosity, wanting to explore things. So all this, it's all connected with language. but we seem to just push it aside and say, okay, if you want to be educated, you'll have to learn English, because that is the language. And of course, as Dr. Tariq Rahman calls it, the language of power. I think it's not that English is really has power or something. It's we made it so. And that is where your topic of your webinar today is so important, that is what Otherism is all about. You keep something and only a small number of people know it. They can take advantage of it, and the vast majority just can't. And then, of course, so since they don't understand this, they want to learn it. That's why when you said, no, that even if they don't know any English, so, and you see, that's what I was wondering, that with these textbooks, the two things which you must keep in mind. First of all, that through the language, the powers that be, the deep state or whatever words we use for them, they are controlling the nation. Because if a child is never encouraged to think, and how will you think? Anya, without a language, you cannot really think. And once you deprive the child of a language, you make the child dumb. He cannot think. You just learn whatever is there in the book, and it's so easy to, make all these, like this gender factor and all these, they just, because the child is just told this is that, he can't question, he cannot ask. And even in religion, this is the whole problem, I would say, that a person cannot ask. And this is what has happened to our education and to our people. And I'm afraid that even many of the schools which claim that they are giving very good education, but I find that children do not think at all. And that suits the establishment, because they're not going to question them. Absolutely. And there's so much stress on technology and science and all, because these subjects, you just acquire those skills, but they consider the humanities to be very, it's nothing, and only people who don't know anything or they are low in intelligence go in for that. Although those are the subjects, if taught properly, they will make a person think. And that is why I always insist that please begin with language, whatever you are teaching. And now what I do want to do, and I hope you all will join in, that we have to have some kind of an advocacy program, campaign to tell people, because I think I tried it very hard for this SNC, but somehow in the end, it was all ignored. And even now, so I'm told that they've just left the language issue to the provinces, and the provinces will do whatever they want, which means they'll do nothing and things will continue as before. And with that is linked everything. If you say this are class-based society, where those who are privileged, who are rich, they all have language as their education. The poor, they are striving to learn English, but they find it difficult, because it's not easy to learn a language. And as someone said, I think English is the most difficult to learn. If you see, some languages are easy, but English is not that easy. So that is, I think, what we need to focus on, is to tell people also that, I think, learn your own language. I agree that you need English in higher education, but by that time, how many people go in for higher education? Those who do, they will be provided opportunities. You can teach some basic English, but those who don't need it, let them be good at whatever they are doing without even knowing English. Even that is possible. Yeah. And don't, in a way, hurt their identity or introduce this otherism and all. That is, I think, my whole contention of what I've been trying to fight for the last, I don't know, at least 2 or 3 decades. So I would love to hear what the others have to say.
Thank you. Earlier this year as well, Zubeida, I was in touch with Abbas Rashid, right, who has actually been also doing research on the language issue for years. And we conducted a webinar that really tried to explore what is the conflict, what are the blockages. And you're right, they do come very much at the political and policy level. So one way, as you're saying, to address that is to have a large-scale advocacy campaign. But in addition to that, I think that having worked in the field on language, they really needs to be perhaps community-based initiatives where you can even have people going door to door to households in various areas to strike a conversation with families to begin to enable them to disassociate learning from English only. I mean, there has to be a community level exercise, I find, because lots of parents, when they don't see a school having been advertising itself as English medium, they don't enroll their child in it. We have about 40% of our students now in low-cost private schools / private schools in the entire country, primarily for the reason that they're advertised as English. And I think we've problematized it, as you say, sufficiently. There's so much literature on it, you know. There is ample evidence from a variety of local and international researchers that is making a compelling case that we're not saying get rid of English. We're saying teach English so that it can be learned, because it is a language to connect with the world. And if you want to be globally competitive or even relevant, you need to learn it. We understand that. We're not asking parents to somehow now give up their switch their aspirations completely. But we are saying you need to accept that it is a foreign language. I have been advocating for this for a couple of years as well. It's very clear to me, you can't teach English even as a second language in Pakistan. It is not a second language. A second language requires, in your household, somebody or the other can speak it fluently. In your context, your marketplaces where you frequent, the language is spoken. That is not the case. So it needs to be taught as a foreign language. And what I actually, Zubeida, I will also pick up on this with you separately with Abbas Sahab as well. I think that there's a campaign that needs to take place. Thank you for such a powerful lesson that you're reminding us of. A child is not learning even otherism or anything if they don't understand the language. They have no access to the learning at all. Thank you. With that, actually, I would like to turn now to Laraib, if you would ask the next questions around otherism and religion, and how otherism comes to life through religion, by speaking with Dr. Saigol.
Thank you, and thank you for such informative for such an informative discussion by everyone. This was of particular interest to me as well. This will be this will really help into my research as well. Now, coming on to religion, I have personally looked at existing research by Naureen as well, and by Dr. Saigol as well, who's done a lot of work on textbooks and the construction of the self and the other, and the predominant involvement of religion in it. Pakistan is a country which was made on the basis of religion, and religion has played a predominant role in the environment of the country. So the first question that I'm going to ask Dr. Saigol is, very simply put, can you talk a little about how otherism happens through the formation of religious identities in education, and how important do you think these religious identities are, because they are kind of overlapping with all of these other markers as well? So if you could speak a little about that.
Yes, thank you, Laraib. Basically, I would like to start by saying that in Pakistan, textbooks and curricula are not written with a pedagogical imperative in mind, not with the idea of promoting the intellectual and cognitive development of children, their learning, their critical thinking. In Pakistan, education has been very subservient to our nationalist ideology, the ideology of the national narrative of national security, the state, and nationalism. As a result, they don't promote critical thinking, or they don't promote questioning, or they don't promote the cognitive development of the child, but instead what is promoted is a very particular kind of religious nationalism, which is exclusive. It tends to exclude what we consider the others of the Muslim identity. Now, when Pakistan became independent and at partition, there was very little content to what does it mean to be a Muslim. And there were so many sects and so many articulations that there was no clear idea. It just was different from Hindu India. Okay, Muslim Pakistan in a binary opposition to Hindu India. And that is why our identity, national identity, as represented in textbooks, came to be defined in terms of the not me, that we are not Hindus, we are not Sikhs, we are not Jews, we are not Christians. So it was a non-identity, a not identity rather than a one filled with positive, because if you start filling it with positive content, then you have to look at all the different sects, and then how do you decide which one to include, which not to include. So that is the basis that our educational system is, and our curriculum development is under the national security narrative rather than for pedagogical purposes. As a result, when we tried to find out who we are, we decided that we are not Hindus, we are not Sikhs, we are not Jews, we are not Christians. We couldn't decide who we are. And therefore, these several others, multiple others, actually constitute who we are. In the sense that the most extreme other, who is not part of the self, who is a stranger, an outsider, different from us and threatening, is the Hindu. Now, the Hindus in Pakistani textbooks are represented as being inherently evil. Like there's no history in it. It is that they were evil because they were evil. They had a caste system and they had inequality, as though, you know, we didn't have a caste system. We have a very strong caste system here. They were always cheating. They were always doing bad things to the Muslims. They were always mistreating Muslims. They were killing Muslims, and they were very cruel, and they were very inhuman. And there was Chanakyanism, and Gandhi was a Chanakyanist, a Machiavellian, and all kinds of negative images about Hindus, without any history of why this is so. How can any nation be inherently evil? Because there must have been a history, something must have happened. I mean, the history of conquest of Sindh, and then later on the establishment of Muslim rule in India, the destruction of temples to build mosques upon, and all that was erased, so that you would think that the entire nation of Hindus is homogenized as one and is inherently evil. And the interesting contradictions therein, and the entire textbooks are filled, especially in social studies, history, social studies, civics, and Islamiyat, as well as in language texts. It is, the entire thing is based on anti-Hindu or anti-India. And this is mainly with our statist, our public schooling system, because the madrasas are not so concerned with Hindus. Interestingly, the madrasa literature is much more focused on refuting Western values, refuting secularism, refuting democracy, refuting modernity. Madrasas concern themselves with that, very little, if at all, with Hinduism. But the state literature, because of our state seeing India as the permanent, lasting, eternal enemy that forever wants to re-ingest us and destroy us and finish us, the state curriculum is obsessed with Hindus, primarily Indian Hindus. And there's a conflation. All Hindus are seen as Indians and all Indians are seen as Hindus, quite forgetting that in India there are other religions residing also. And the inherently evil idea is extremely essentialist, because you tell no history of the conflict, who Hindus are, what happened, conquest and establishment of Muslim rule. And some interesting contradictions are that while there is an enormous glorification in our textbooks of the destruction of Hindu temples, mainly by Mahmud Ghaznavi, and we are very proud that 17 times he attacked Somnath and he destroyed idols and he was an iconoclast and not an idol worshipper, and how he looted those temples of all their wealth, and how the poor priest begged him, pleaded with him to please not to destroy their temples. But he said, no, I am Buddhishan and not a Buddhaparast, I am an iconoclast, so I will destroy. And we glorify that no end in every textbook. On the other hand, the same textbook in a little bit later in the next few pages really decries the destruction of Babri Masjid. Constantly, like the contradiction is not perceived from one page to the next. Okay, if it was wonderful for Mahmud of Ghazni to destroy the Somnath temple, why was it very bad of those horrible, awful Hindus to destroy Babri Masjid? And how is it different? But there's a lot of condemnation of that destruction to show how evil the Hindus are, and a lot of glorification of Muslim violence. Also the temple of Debel, which was attacked by Muslims, and they pelted stones, and they they used a sangeen, a kind of a stone throwing machine to destroy the temple, climb up the walls and take over the temple in Debel. And the imagery in that description, if I had time, I could read it out, but I don't have time today, so it's in my papers, is akin to rape. it's like, you know, forcible entry, breaking down the door, clambering up the walls, entering the rebel temple to destroy it. So there's a lot of contrasting imagery about, you know, how destruction is fine and wonderful when we do it, and it's horrible when they do it. So we are obsessed with Hindu India and vis-a-vis Muslim Pakistan. And whenever we talk about Muslims having defeated the Hindus, having won a war, it is because they are brave and they're strong and they're valiant, you know. And whenever Hindus lose a war, something, it's because they are inherently evil, because they are not strong, because they don't have strength, they are not fighters, they are not warriors, because they are vegetable eaters, we eat meat, so we are stronger. So there is a feminization of Hindus, that Hindus are weak, timid, subordinate, feminized, they can't fight, they're not strong. And in contrast, Muslims are brave and strong, and every time they've been defeated in history, it's only been because they were betrayed. It was Mir Jafar in Bengal, and, you know, Amir Sadiq in Deccan with Tipu Sultan. You know, one betrayed Sirajuddaula, the other betrayed Tipu Sultan. So our heroes, national heroes, were betrayed by our own people, and that's why they lost, but not because they were not brave or strong or good enough fighters. So there's a feminization of Hindus, and consequently a hyper-masculinization of Muslim identity. Pakistani Muslims and Pakistanis are very masculine and strong and dominant. Now, this is our main construction of our religious identity, is not Hindu, not India. But then there are others who also construct parts of our identity, and they are, for example, Jews. Now, Jews appear very little in our textbooks because there aren't very many in Pakistan. So basically, they always appear in the quintessential trope of Shylock. They appear as a caricature, and they're always Shylock. They are greedy usurers who, in order to get their money, and usually destroyed Muslim societies and killed them. And there's a very strong conflation of Jews, Zionists, and Israelis. Now, not all Jews are Zionists, not all Zionists are Jews, and not all Jews are Israelis, but there's a lot of conflation. And moving from one to the other is very easy, and they are invariably, they appear as Shylock. And nothing else, that they are greedy and they are miserly, and they tend to destroy others through the use of money. And there's no concept of a Jew who could be poor, a Jew who could be very generous. No, they just exist there. No other history, nothing about the Jews. Then talking about Christians, the Christians appear as those who were always intriguing with the Hindus to defeat the Muslims. They were always into conspiracies, and they were cheating, and they were always sort of trying to deceive the Muslims. And it's interesting that when the class 7 textbook, which I studied, was looking at the Crusades, it was always Christian identity. Christians did this to Muslims, Christians did that, they imposed taxes on us, they were very mean to us, they were very cruel to us. But in the context of British India, they are the English or the British. So the reference changes when you're speaking of the context of independence and the freedom movement, they are the British or they are the English. But in the context of the Crusades, they're always referred to in their religious identity. So that is mostly about them, and nothing else, of course, about Christianity as a religion or its history or whatever, its interactions with Islam or with Muslims. And the other entity that appears very often in our textbooks is the Sikh identity. And it appears in our textbooks at 2 occasions. One is when, at the end of the Mughal Empire, the Sikhs took over Punjab, and the other is at partition. And they invariably appear as these kirpan-wielding butchers and killers and murderers. Because the story of partition is being told, and suddenly there are these riots and everybody's killing everybody else, but mainly it's the Sikhs who are carrying kirpans, killing Muslim children, beheading them, raping Muslim women. Now, of course, the reality is that during partition, every community mistreated every other community. Hindu women were raped, Muslim women were raped, Sikh women were raped, and usually in front of gurdwaras and mandirs and masjids. But invariably, it is the Sikh who is represented as the killer, the marauder. And there's no other history, who the Sikhs were, what is their religion, where do they come from. So, as I've often said in my writing, there's no history in this history, that you don't have anything like causes, and you don't have anything like, the antecedents, what happened, what led to this, what is the cause of this, what was the conflict, how it, any economic causes, ideological causes, political, territorial. It is always that these communities are caricatures. They are just essential, some things, and essential nations, and they don't have any other characteristics apart from being evil. Hindus don't have any other characteristics apart from being marauders and killers and butchers. Sikhs don't have any other characteristics. Similarly, the Jews are just greedy, and that's it. And similarly, the British are just basically conspirators and cheats and tricksters. And in opposition, in contrast to all these, the self, which is actually threatened by all these, is very good. The Muslim is good. He's not a cheat or a trickster. He doesn't have the caste system. The Muslim self is great, is brave and strong in contrast to them, and it's not destructive. They destroy us. We don't destroy their temples and stuff. So it's a very, very binary, as earlier Naureen was talking about, the binary construction of gender. It's a very binary construction, us and others, us and them. And they have all the bad characteristics, and all the good is attributed to the self. And interesting concepts of space and time are used to construct the other, the Hindu other particularly, also others. Things like concepts of space. In a description of religious spaces, there is a description in which Hindu temples are described as dark and narrow. It's very narrow and very dark, and only one person can go in there at one time. And they worship alone, not in congregation. So their religious space sounds like something that is suspicious, something that is suspect, something that's not all, kosher. And in contrast, they talk about Muslim masjids and Muslim mosques, and they are open and they are well lit, and lots of people gather together in a congregation and pray together. Like it's all, open, and it's all out in public. It's all in full view, and there's light on it. And so their places are dark, ours are light. Theirs are narrow, ours are broad and open. So there is an implication that there is something very devious about Hindus. There's something very hidden, concealed, and devious, while all the Muslims are praying together openly. And all these minarets are so phallic. If you look at them, they are so phallic in their construction. That's where Muslims pray, so it's superior. So concepts of space and architecture, that Indian architecture before Islam was extremely narrow and tight gullies and narrow streets, and it showed that their minds and thinking was narrow. And when Muslims came, they introduced very full architecture, the kind of architecture, broad, open, and wide spaces. And the other concept, apart from space, is time, the concept of time. Because when you're reading the text, everything that came before Islam was all evil, was the worship of false ideals, and was a dark period and negative period, Dore Jahiliya as it is called. After the Muslims came, so it's a before-after dichotomy, before-after construction of time, the bad time and the good time. After the Muslims enter this time, everything becomes pak, and everything becomes good, and everything becomes pious and great and wonderful and clean and cleansed of all the evil that was before. And everything, all the bad practices, gambling and drinking and wine and all of that came from Christians and Jews. They brought in all the bad practices, because after Islam, Muslims had only good practices. They gave up wine, they gave up gambling, so everything bad came from before and from the other. So the concepts of time and space, and there's a strange conflation. While textbook writers, while speaking of Arabia, pre-Islamic Arabia, suddenly start talking about pre-Islamic India. And it's almost like they talk of it as though it's the same society. Like you're talking about the Kaaba and the false ideals and how they were broken and how the true religion was inserted there. Suddenly, they're talking about Hindus and how they have caste system and they worship bad ideals without any change, that you're now talking of a totally different society. But because they have this commonality of both being pre-Islamic bad societies, being overtaken by the Muslim good society, therefore there is this conflation. So by using time in before-after terms, and by using space in them and us, their temples and our temples, their streets and our streets, time and space concepts are used to create the dichotomies of us and them. And I will end by saying some of the common things that I found for all these religions, common among all these, to just round off the discussion. All religious communities are essentialized into just being homogeneous, only one. Within Hindus, there are no internal differences. There are no classes. There are no good Hindus. There are no women. There are no, it's just one bad society with everybody being identical and bad. And in contrast, of course, all Muslims are good and great and wonderful. There are no bad Pakistanis or bad Muslims. It's just bad things happen to us, but we are not bad. All communities are frozen in time. There's no historical change. Hindus, Sikhs, Jews, and Christians, everybody's talked about as though that you took a snap in time and this is what you saw and they are forever that way, that they have historically not changed. It's an extremely ahistorical and essentialist discourse which presents people as though they have existed primordially and are still that way, and they haven't changed and cannot change. There is no history in this history, as I just said earlier. There's no explanations, no causes. If there was usury among the Jews at a certain time period, what were the economic reasons for that? What were the political reasons? If the Sikhs were killing the Muslims, what was happening? What was partition? Why were communities killing one another? What were the causes? There's never any explanation of causes, antecedents, something that would help you understand why somebody's doing anything, because the why and how questions lead to critical thinking, and that has to be stopped through these textbooks. And there's no knowledge or information about these communities other than that Sikhs are butchers and Hindus are just evil and they are Machiavellian and the Jews are greedy, etc. There's no other information, as though they are one-dimensional people. They don't have any other dimensions except to hate us and to be our enemies. And so because of this construction of the curriculum, in the same paper from which I am drawing all this that I wrote some years ago, in fact many years ago, in the same paper I also talk of the Bengali other, which is much more complicated because they were the self and the other at the same time. They were not really another and they were not really the self. They were different and separate and all. So they were not fully us and they were not fully them. And therefore, it's much more complicated with how the second partition between Pakistan and Bangladesh is treated, because there is much greater moral confusion and much greater ambiguity about the us and them. So this is how, by creating a host of religions, multiple others, we construct our own identity, which is in negative terms. That we are not this or not that. And we still are trying to find in Pakistan what is our positive identity, like who are we? Okay, we are not Hindu India, then who are we? And that is still a question that's plaguing a lot of people in Pakistan. And also of the minorities. The Hindu children are asking, but I am not Muslim, what about me? Christians are saying, what, we are not Muslim. Because the textbook says every child in Pakistan is a Muslim and every child is a... So what the minorities cannot relate to this curriculum, to these textbooks, and because of this exclusion. So I guess I think I've taken more time than was allotted, so I stop.
No, thank you so much. That was brilliantly articulated, Dr. Saigol, and it was very, very informative and very powerful. I do want to mention that this article of yours, I've read multiple times for my own research. And there is a particular quote from your 1995 thesis that I often use in talking about the Hindu other. And it's a very small line in a 1995 social studies textbook, which very clearly shows how the other is constructed. And it just simply says, Hindu is an enemy of Islam without any context. And that really shows, and there's no context of it, they're just your enemies. And so which really brings to the fore the question, which is something that I often think about and that I want to find from my own research, is that how does it serve us? So if we're constructing the gendered other, or we're constructing the religious other, we're talking about how Hindus are bad, Jews are bad, Christians are bad, Bengalis are bad, all of these people are really bad, we're really good. But what does that really show us? That are we insecure in our own identity? What is our identity? Is it so ambiguous? Are we so insecure with ourselves that we have to keep on reiterating that the other is so bad, look at the other, they're so bad, to kind of re-emphasize, to emphasize how good we are? And that is a question that probably I would like to pose in the question and answer session, because I want to ask all the panelists, How has this served? How has this served the students? Why does it exist? And so thank you so much for giving concrete examples of how this otherism is happening in the textbooks. And that is, I think, very informative for our panelists and the attendees as well, because they can see how this is happening. But I would really want to kind of speak about in some time after Camilla has spoken about why this is happening in the first place and how this is serving us at the end of the day. So I'm going to hand over to Aanya now, so she can continue with Camilla, and then we will go over to the question and answer session. But thank you so much, Dr. Saigol. That was amazing.
Thank you. Thank you, and Naureen and all the others.
Thank you, Laraib, for capturing that. I feel like I have goosebumps, but I also need a couple of hours to process this because it resonates. It's too powerful. It's so obvious, yet it's so implicit. The contradictions are so obvious, yet they're so implicit. It's as if we are on a continuum. We are being tricked. And I think that, and Dr. Saigol, I mean, I'll write to you about this too, and maybe if we have time towards the end. I'm very curious to know that when these initial textbooks that were to be used in Pakistan's newly created Pakistan schools to be used, who reviewed them? Who created them? Who wrote them? Who was monitoring them? Was there a certain desperation to have something in schools, or was there a deliberate, systematic approach which said we will otherize? It would be, I think it'd be, for me, that's a burning question, but I'll hold back. I'd now like to turn to Camilla, and this will bring our conversation with the panelists in terms of sections to a close, and then we'll move to Q&A. But Camilla, my question for you is, could you tell us from your own reading of the metric level Urdu textbook in Pakistan on how do these markers of exclusion play out?
Thank you, Aanya. I wish that I had gone first because I'm so overwhelmed by everything that I'm still processing. But so yes, thank you to all the greats on this panel. Before I get onto the Urdu textbook, I just wanted to say in context to what Dr. Saigol was talking about, I think it's important to really look at the partition of Pakistan, the formation of Bangladesh as a key political moment in when our focus or our objectives from education changed at a political level. And I think that because the partition of Pakistan really questioned the need for Pakistan in a way, right? Because we were, as you said, we were the Muslims and we were separating based on our religious identity, but then we couldn't live together even as Muslims. So what does that mean? And this then links to the concept of us trying to create our own identity and how we forge that identity. And you're absolutely right, Dr. Saigol, in that, or at least I completely agree with you in saying that we are very clear, or we really spent a lot of time talking about what we are not, but very little on what we are in a positive way. But what I do want to bring up at this point is one of the things that happened post the 1971 breakup of the country and within education that I have seen in a broader review is also that we started aligning with a pan-Islamic identity. We moved away from our cultural identity more towards a religious identity so we became part of this sort of a broader pan-Islamic kind of, the Gulf and Saudi and so forth. And that really has impacted the agenda formation that we see towards religion in our education as well. Right. So, and so that kind of links to what I wanted to talk about today. So broadly, what I'm basically going to just bring to the fore is my reading of as Aanya said, the Urdu literature textbook that is published by the Sindh Textbook Board for the years 9 and 10. And it connects to what Zubeida Appa was talking about, why I studied this Urdu textbook. Because I looked at, I really studied the Urdu text because of the importance of humanities. I fully agree with her in that humanities is the one area where we look at values, culture, our cultural history, our understanding, and we try and put that within a context that's not prescriptive, but really can be interpreted and be understood. And that was my reason for studying the Urdu textbook. So just to put into context also about the Urdu textbook, because I see from our participants that we have a lot of sort of non-Pakistanis. The Urdu textbook in the metric system, which is the national curriculum of Pakistan, it's a compulsory subject. And the book that I studied was broadly a literature textbook, but its learning outcomes were also language, grammar, and literature interpretation. And so it was divided between prose and poetry. So it's really interesting how this book is constructed. There are 3 or 4 things that come into mind when I talk about this book. The first is agenda formation, which I mentioned. And the second is audience, and the third is subject. And audience and subject are linked because let's go back to the agenda formation. In looking at all of these 3 concepts, I look at content, the choice of authors, the type of questions that they pose at the end, and also the layout of the books. And these 4 aspects of looking at this book actually provide a sort of a landscape of how this book others 2 key groups that we've talked about, which is religion and gender. It doesn't really focus on language as much because at this level, the students are expected to be proficient in Urdu. So, and it doesn't really involve the politics of language, as Zubeida mentioned. So I'm really going to only focus on religious and gender inclusion. In the context of what we've been talking about, my reading of this book shows that the preferred identity that this book is addressing and is addressing to and addressing about is Muslim and male. It talks, and there are many, this sort of identity formation is pervasive throughout the book, but there are certain key texts that really stand out in it, and I'm going to use them as examples for everybody. One is a text called Nazariya-e-Pakistan, which is called the ideology of Pakistan. This is a highly objectionable text. It's historically inaccurate. It tries to place the ideology of Pakistan and the identity of Pakistan in a historical context and really exemplifies all the kind of inaccuracies and fallacies that Dr. Saigol was talking about by misrepresenting not just anybody other than, well, misrepresenting the Hindus of India, but also the Muslims of India. And not doing justice to either, misrepresenting facts, showing the Hindu as a conniving community that was out to bring down the Muslims, as you said, and really does this explicitly and descriptively, and simplifies historical events to the point that they're inaccurate, and also positions, as Laraib brought up, Hindus as the enemy of Islam and Muslims. Now, the question, this work was written in the mid to early 20th century. A lot of the authors in this book are pre-partition and are actually deceased, and that particular point is also relevant. But my question that always comes into this is, why was this work included? Well, to my mind, this work was included exactly as an operationalization of what Dr. Saigol said, of the agenda, of creating that identity that you are you have been victimized, B, you need to protect yourself as a community from this big neighbor that is there, and explicitly putting those India as the enemy, and also positioning India as a metaphor, like you said, for Hindus, right? And so then that becomes important, because what about the Hindu kids in your classroom? How do that then becomes explicit othering of them, because suddenly their faith defines them, not their passport, if you will, not the fact that they are Pakistani. Their faith defines them as Pakistani, and they are lesser Pakistanis than those who are Muslim. So that is one aspect of one work that really stood out. Other aspects that also bring up in terms of religion that stand out is, this is an Urdu literature textbook. This is not an Islamiyat textbook. Yet every section starts with some religious work. whether it's Akhlaq-e-Nabwi, which is the life and teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, nothing wrong with it per se, but does it need to be in an Urdu textbook? Why is it not? And if so, if you want, without getting into the debate about secular versus non-secular education, if you're going to try to be non-secular, then you should, or at least try and be broadly non-secular and have a broad-based view on it, which this book does not at all. So again, by virtue of positioning religious texts, it others those that don't have any sort of religious relevance to that. And my third point also brings into the points about militarism that was also brought up. Militarism, again, in a literature textbook, there are several works that talk about, that celebrate militarism. One work in particular that comes out is titled Shaheed, which means a martyr. And it glorifies the achievements of the Pakistani soldier. It glorifies the fact that they were it's a play, which is really interesting because it's a play written in 1966. So automatically it refers to the 1965 war, that this soldier has died in the 1965 war. And it shows, it's focused on the family mourning the death of this soldier. So it's creating kind of a subversive, sympathy-led approach to celebrating the achievements of the military, but also showing that, look, we were attacked by the Indians in 1965. Look, they killed our young men. So that in itself is also a problem. And also the other aspect of this, which stood out to me, is what they do not celebrate. They do not celebrate non-military heroes. They do not celebrate any non-Muslim. There's no mention in the book of any kind of even literature-based text on any achievements of people. If you're going to bring something like Shaheed, there's always people like Maulana Idi to talk about, or other heroes, or non-Muslim military heroes. That level of inclusion is not there. So in a sense, this book brings to life all of the conceptual theories that all of you have been talking about today. It makes it very real. So moving on from the religion towards gender content, I'm going to stick with the work Shaheed, because to some extent, for me, the work Shaheed was more problematic about gender than it was even about religion and positioning India as the other. The work is about a sister that's mourning her brother who died as a hero, who's the Shaheed, who's the martyr. And there's nothing wrong per se about what she's saying, but the positioning of the sister in relevance to the brother, as it really exemplifies what Dr. Durrani was talking about, is that the woman is always seen in the context of the male. She is the other binary, and she is subjugated to the male within the family. So there's a line in the work that says that how the sister always wanted us to celebrate the birthday of the brother, how she always looked towards glorifying the brother, and he is no longer there, and how she is mourning the brother. And there's no element of her own identity. In fact, it's absolutely glossed over. So not only is the fact that he was a soldier masculinized, but also the fact that the woman is just there as a mourner for the brother, and as and has a role within the family hierarchy as supportive of the brother. This also brings up to another work, the same thing about this relation within family, about another work called Rishta Nata. This is a really interesting work, and it builds it in a very personal level. Rishta Nata basically means family relations, and it's a work that talks about family relations in the South Asian context, how you must love and respect your parents, how your family is there to support support you and to take care of you, and if something happens to you, your uncles will take care of you, and your extended family will take care of you, and how that is a sort of a cultural context. Except that 80% is focused on your paternal relations. So if out of 4 pages, I was reading, actually I literally just did the number of reading the pages, out of the 4 or 5 pages that this text is, half a page is to your maternal parents. maternal relations. Automatically, the child, the 14, 15-year-old child that is reading it is saying, okay, my mother's family is on by the side. My paternal family, my paternal links are my identity. It is my father's brother, my paternal grandfather, and so forth. So that was one aspect of it, where it's a subversive way of presenting the male form as your identity, your larger identity, which is reflective of how we look at family in Pakistan and generally in South Asia, if you will. And second aspect of it was, of course, the very explicit relation of the father or the men in the family are looked at as somebody to be respected and obeyed and loved, and the mother is the source of love. So there's less of having to give back to the mother, but more to take that the mother is this, again, this revered, domesticated source of love and happiness and nurturing, but not necessarily an equal partner and an equal within the whole family setup. So all of these aspects that bring to my mind is the fact that it brings back to my question of who is the audience. And I will perhaps defer a little bit with Dr. Durrani's earlier point about that the audience is, I believe you said the word was, I've lost my note somewhere. But you said there was a, audience has become, audience in waiting. Sorry, you said the word was an audience in waiting. And I actually think that to my mind, to my reading of this book, the audience has already been defined as a Muslim male. It's not so much that they want to create the views. And I fully see that at a younger age, this is less defined. But to my mind, this is an audience male because they are, the choice of content that is in this book has defined that. And this is further developed by two other aspects. One is the choice of authors. Most of these authors, it's really interesting because most of these authors were pre-partition. So when I first looked at this book, I got quite excited with the fact that, okay, they're a pre-partition, there's going to be something more interesting, and there's a sort of a celebration of our joint culture that predates Pakistan. But actually, no, it's based on a very gendered choice of authors in that they choose these authors who spoke at that time, who wrote to a male audience, who wrote about males for a male audience. So in that selection, I see a genderization that was very informative to my mind. Again, in terms of choice of authors, I'm going to jump onto also the interesting thing about who they choose. So in the context of religious minorities and women, there is one non-Muslim author and one female author. That's it. Out of all of them, the rest are all male and Muslim. Thankfully, the non-Muslim is not a female. So at least we get two that are not male and Muslim. But there's Munshi Premchand, who is obviously an established author of Urdu from United India at the time. And his work is included. And then there is a poetess called Ada Jafri, who's included in this work. Now, Munshi Premchand's work it's an interesting work, but it doesn't merit as much in terms of looking at the role of religious minorities that is included here, as does Ada Jafri's work. So Ada Jafri's work is a ghazal, which is a romantic poem that is included in a list of the greats like Ghalib and Mir and so forth. And we all know that these are the greats and the well-known people of poets of the subcontinent. So she's included there, and it's important to say that she's included there because she's included in this big lineup. The choice of her work is really interesting because it's a very passionate ghazal of a woman's unrequited love for a man. So I thought that was quite interesting because it was giving a voice to the woman. But really interesting is two things about how Ada Jafri is presented in the book, which is also very telling. Out of this whole, I would say about 25 to 30 items in this book, she is the very, very last. She's very last, she's put right at the end. In fact, I had to search because I kept going to the index. I couldn't find her work. She's right at the end. And it's almost like an afterthought. So it's, to my mind, if I was a teacher, I would say, like, if I have time to cover this particular ghazal, I will cover it. And so that to me was kind of putting her as you know, it's really like an afterthought. Because all of these authors that are that are included in this book, or most of them, not all, but most of them, are from a suggested list from the national curriculum document. So I have actually seen these names in the, not only are they from a list, but the national curriculum for the metric level for Urdu actually says that, okay, in the prose, these are the list of authors that you should really source your work from. And then in the poetry, you have, the ghazals and nazms, and you must have a hamd and a naat from these particular authors and so forth. So there's not a lot of agency and independence in how they can choose the authors for this book, but obviously within the authors, they could choose certain different works. But interestingly, they chose Ada Jafi. She's also the only female author that is prescribed by the national curriculum. So it's, to some extent, we have to take that onus away from the textbook and put it onto the curriculum. But the placement is not decreed. So the placement is also put at the end. And then the other interesting thing I found was this. Every author, before their text or before their work is placed, has a short one-page biography, which really talks about where they studied, who they were, who their great influences were, and what their scholarship was based on.
Mm-hmm.
Ada Jafri is the only one whose the second line states the name of her husband. That's it. That's the second most important thing that is there. But this is Ada Jafri. She's a poetess. Her husband was so-and-so. No importance about whether the husband, I don't know whether the husband was an academic or a scholarship or a writer who I should know. I hadn't heard of him, but I do know he was her husband. So that, now for the student who is studying this, for the girl student, she is looking and saying, okay, no matter the fact that this author is somebody that I'm studying, her husband is important. It must be known that she was a married woman, that she was not, she may be talking about passionate love, but you know what? It's okay, because she did have a husband who was the recipient of it. This is all just, this is make-believe stuff that she's doing. She wasn't really longing for another man, and she's not a woman of loose morals. I mean, all of this comes in from that simple addition of the fact that she was a married woman, and to me, that just screamed out in terms of the positioning of gender within this book. So I found that really, really interesting. My final point about talking about how the othering happens is really just to talk about the question of trying to teach students critical engagement, and how we perhaps don't want them to think. One of the things that when I was reading the works and I was looking at them, and I was thinking that, okay, well, if the questions perhaps, what can they find, and how can they pull out something so that the teacher can then maybe go beyond what is the content of this work and really kind of try and make the students engage with it, and is there scope for it? But as you rightly said, we are such an assessment question textbook based education system that really the teachers are only trained to connect with the questions that they are given and prescribed. The questions, to put it simply, have in no way questioned the kind of content that is in the book. There's no critical engagement, and in fact, there's a reinforcement. In the work about the Shaheed, there is find great other examples of great military shuhada that have existed in the past, shuhada being other martyrs. Find other examples of relationships in your family where the paternal is important, and how they connect. So they really just are there to reinforce. And all of this brings it back to the point of agenda formation, that the book, this is a literature textbook for 15-year-olds. This is the end of their academic. Many of these students will no longer study. And the agenda formation is explicit, it is political, and it is both gendered in that it looks at it privileges the male student. Its audience, to my mind, is male. Its subject matter actually is very often male. So, sorry, I didn't actually dwell on that as much. But because these authors were writing at that point, the gendered, how they approach gender is always masculine, right? It's never talked about a woman. The woman is a separate object of discussion when she is brought into the literature. Otherwise, it's always, the neutral is always male. And so that adds to the fact that the identity that they are promoting through the choice of authors, choice of content, the way it's organized and layout, is Muslim and male. and so it really kind of brings it to life. So really the concepts that everybody has been talking about today come to life in this book. And it's interesting to also to see that one of the reasons that I studied, I looked at this book rather than looking at the Pakistan Studies book or at the Islamiyat book, to look at sort of othering and discrimination of, because my focus at the time when I was looking at this was really looking at religious minorities, was because I thought that the Urdu textbook would be perhaps have more scope for interpretation. And it has more than I think than the Islamiyat and the other textbook, but it's fairly explicit in it as well. And it really, for me, it showed that the agenda formation and the kind of that formation of identity that permeates the others is as alive in this. So that's my thing. Thanks, Anya.
Thank you so much, Camilla. That was very, very insightful. And again, you did give us concrete examples from a textbook and spoke about all of the intersections of all of the things that we've been covering. We're really short on time, so which is why I'm going to immediately start the Q&A session. And I want to apologize because we won't be able to take everyone's questions. We will only be able to take 3 questions. And I'm just going to immediately start with the first one. The first question is for Dr. Naureen by Abdul Ghaffar. And the question is, how and where is gender inequality reflected in curriculum? In your experience, I know Camilla has made some points from a particular textbook, and we have you have spoken a little about it, but if you could give some profound examples from your own experience. You're muted. You're muted.
Gender inequality is pervasive in all textbooks, including mathematics, for example, which supposedly would not think to be a textbook where there is an explicit agenda to construct gender. But even there, when you look at the examples, the visibility is there for males. Again, the questions that are set up, they specify what is the rightful place of a woman, what's the rightful place of a man. So it's in English language. It's I think to an extent it's where Islamiyat talks more about gender equality rather than these language textbooks or mathematics textbooks and Pakistan studies textbooks. So really, that's the one where explicitly gender equality is addressed and the rights of women in Islam are addressed. Other than that, all textbooks give a very loud message, a very clear message of, you know, it's fine. The subordination of women to men is fine.
Thank you so much. The next question is for Zubedia Mustafa, and the question is by Neha Rahil. The question is, how much is this language in textbooks? How much of this is unique to Pakistan? And how much of it is simply a product of the nation state project? Because the nation state, specifically in the context of insecure post-colonies, is premised on the very otherization of that is being spoken about here. So Neha is basically asking how much of that is what role ideology has to, the national ideology has to play here, and how much of it is a product of the nation state project.
Well, actually, as far as education goes, I'm just confining myself to education. If you notice that as far as language goes and this otherization, it is dividing the nation itself. Like in the other thing, whether it's gender or religion, you are putting the nation on one side and the others, on the other, which is the other nation, whether it's another religion or whatever it might be. But in language, you actually divide the nation itself. And so that is why I think the ideology factor, what I would say, and I've been saying it, and I found that generally not talked about much, is, you know, this class divide. And that is the main thing. That when I say that language is dividing the country, it is dividing the country like the other is, well, if you say those who are in power, who are making the courses, who are writing the books and all, or who choose the textbooks, if you consider them the us, then the others are the rest of the nation, at least 60–70% of them who are not from that class. And that is my main concern. And with education also, when you talk about textbooks, so now you see the government, like even the SNC, it is only applying to the government schools, who are taking, I think, they say that now about 30–40% of the students are going to private schools, and the remaining are in government schools, which is a very small number if you think of it. That is the government whose responsibility it is to educate the child. So they are in a way exposed to all that we've been speaking about. And the others, it's worse. Like for them, it is that, well, we are the privileged one, and they are the rest of the nation. It's not even Hindu India or the Jews or anything of the kind. So that is what worries me most, that it is actually destroying the country. And over there, the ideologies might be, of course, they have to bring in those ideologies also. They do come in. But sometimes you have cases of books taken from, foreign publishers, and then with the names not even changed, the child can't even understand the name. Some of them, I find it's so sorry really, because I've done a lot of voluntary teaching in these classes. And this is what I say, that they can't even understand the names, the names of people and how they see it. So that's why I always insist that please address the language issue first, because I don't know what you have said. Maybe one thing positive about it, about this language thing, is that it is true. All the analyses were excellent, which you all made. But how much is really conveyed to the child, I don't know, because nobody talked about the key books. They are the ones, the textbooks are not even used. The key books, which are written, I think it's such a flourishing business that every year you have those 5 years papers, and whatever's written there, the children just learn it. And this is the problem with the language, that there's a lot of rote learning. How much they understand, I don't know. Maybe you all could do some research to find out that where's all this, for instance, the religiosity coming in our society, when most of the people are not even educated, they're not exposed to these textbooks. So who's bringing them in? I think it's through the mosque, the madrasas, or whatever it would be. But I hope I answered the question.
Yes, you did. And I think Naureen wants to say something. Yes, please.
Yeah, it's just in response to what Zubeida Appa asked. My own research in Pakistan in very disadvantaged schools indicate that when it comes to identity formation, the messages are infiltrated. Students might not be able to read English properly, or to write an English text or read Urdu properly, because these were in schools in Khyber Pakhtunkhwa, where Urdu was a second language rather than a national language. Homogeneous villages where Urdu is not spoken at all outside the schools. But when it comes to identity messages, very strong identifications with the textbook, both in terms of religion and in terms of gender. And as Zubeida Appa said, students are not getting education just from textbook, they are getting it from all different sources. And simultaneously, many of these students attended a madrasa either before school or after school. So the community values and identities kind of overlapped. And earlier I said gender is intersected by other markers. And, here it was a disadvantaged class background. In other contexts where both girls or boys might have exposure to other ways of being, other discourses than the textbook, then they are in a position to draw selectively or challenge some of the text that is there. Otherwise, if for the child, the discourse outside the school is more or less similar as what is being presented at school, there is a strong sense of identification, converging imaginaries of the nation, as I call it.
Excuse me, Dr. Naureen is absolutely correct. Because, most of the children, they are going to school and also to a madrasa. And somehow the madrasa seems to dominate. And when I say madrasa, I don't mean, I mean, you would also know that it's not what we generally speak about, those madrasas set up by various Wafaqi board and others and teaching different sectarian things. It's also these small women who open the school and the children come there just to read the Quran. But it's not the Quran they are learning. They're getting so many other messages too. That is the whole thing. And that is what is actually infiltrating into the child rather than the textbooks and what they learn in school.
Yes. Thank you so much again. That was really insightful. I'm going to ask one more question from one of the panelists and then some closing comments from all of the panelists. Alia Khalid is asking, Dr. Saigol, do you think that the inability of the Pakistani education as a whole to enable learners to historicize and politicize knowledge is a key problem here?
Yes, I think that that's more or less what I was trying to say in my presentation, that basically when your knowledge is so depoliticized and dehistoricized and you don't understand any history or why things happened or how they came to be, then you don't understand anything, because what happened in the 1959 policy, education policy, the Sharif report, as it is widely known during the Ayub era, is that they reduced, they reduced the social studies curriculum overall, and they actually took away history. Formerly, history used to be a full subject by itself. We used to study history independently. What they did in that 1959 policy Sharif report was that they clubbed history with geography and civics and reducing each one, so that the children of Pakistan are not taught anything about our, our economy or our politics or whatever. And all the textbooks seem to end at partition, end at with independence, etc. Very few, hardly any textbooks tell you about what happened after that, what happened after 47 in Pakistan. So many of them don't know what happened during the Ayub era or Zia era or Bhutto era, and this whole generation has grown up not knowing anything about Pakistan except from partition times. So basically what we did was we reduced the history portion by making it 1/3 of the social studies. As a result, there's a lot of the history. For example, many students don't know that our identity in South Asia is actually connected with India and with the soil, which goes back thousands of years, and Chandragupta Maurya Empire and all that is our history. And because his history was totally changed during the Zia era, a lot of our students think that our identity comes from Makkah, Medina, it comes from Saudi Arabia. So there's been a massive Saudiization of our national identity because of not teaching history in terms of the khitta, the geography of this place, teaching it ideologically and connecting it, because before partition, and Muhammad bin Qasim and all, we go to Arabia. That's where our history comes from, instead of back to India and the older empires of India and the rise of Buddhism and all that. We're not taught that. And we're not taught anything after we supposedly became independent. So there's a huge, there are huge missing pieces, and which is why when you talk to young people, you get shocked because of the large number of things that we took for granted when we were studying or we knew them, that they don't know. And that then colors your consciousness and the way you relate to people, and your politics and your thinking is all colored by all that you don't know. And so I just had one question that I wanted to ask Zubeida Afa. That a lot of people say that Urdu too is a colonizing language. English is not the only colonizing language in Pakistan. Urdu too colonizes because the Balochis, Sindhis and Pakhtuns feel that their languages have been denigrated, and Punjab is sort of like a colonizing province because it has taken over from the Goras, from the English, and become the local colonizer of other identities. So does she also see this, that Urdu too is a colonizing language, and that education should be perhaps in Pashto and Sindhi and Punjabi and Balochi rather than in Urdu? I just wanted to know her views on this.
No, well, actually, I've spoken so much about it, Rubina, that maybe now I've even stopped speaking. But the fact is that I've always said it's the mother tongue. I've never said Urdu. and only about 7% of the population of Pakistan, they have Urdu as the mother tongue, and otherwise
Right.
the rest are not. And that is what I mean, I even insist, and all the scholars also who are working on language, they all insist that it should be the mother tongue. Like even the TCF, they started with Urdu, and I had quite a long discussion, and it's an ongoing discussion. It's now that they've started, because they said we don't have fun, we can't have different languages, so we just take to Urdu. But I know Urdu is resented in all the other places, and what it's the same idea that if a child cannot understand the language, so for him or her it becomes a foreign language. And if a child in a village in Punjab cannot understand Urdu, so it's like English only for that person. That is the whole thing, and that's why when we insist, in fact, even in the SNC, they had first said, I mean, they didn't even speak of Urdu, then they brought it in. But then it had to be delayed because we kept on insisting that you must make it mother tongue. But even that is now not acceptable to people because English is in a way dominating. And this is what happens, that one language dominates, the others are squeezed out, and then and that is how you get the activists, because they are the ones who are fighting for the languages which are now dying. And with the death of the language, it's also the culture and the identity of a person which dies. So that's what is of most concern. And I'm glad you brought up these issues, Anya, because they are important. And do think of this issue about otherism within the country itself, not just with the others.
Absolutely.
Also, because it's, sorry for interrupting, but also because now education after the 18th passage of the 18th Amendment is a provincial issue. Hopefully, Zubeida Appa may know this better, there's a chance of the provinces bringing in the vernaculars and the regional languages much more than when the national curriculum was made by the central ministry, a federal ministry of education. Now that education is, and the single national curriculum actually militates against the idea that education is provincial. It's a provincial subject. The federal government cannot actually legislate on it. But hopefully the provinces are going to bring into curricula their own cultures and histories and folk tales and legends and, you know, their own consciousness and their own knowledge.
No, actually, you know, that was there even before. And this SNC itself was in a way a contradiction in terms, but they used all kinds of political devices by setting up a curriculum board and getting the provinces to agree. But in this respect, I can tell you one thing, that whatever the Prime Minister might have said about apartheid and they want, I mean, he is quite off the mark. It's all right. I mean, what he says is correct in principle, but this is no way of trying to finish the division within the classes. What you need is that there must be good education for everyone, at least to a certain level. And the other thing which now I feel is important, that people, the children, should be learning their own, you know, what like Rubina said about history and all. Because like now that we have children, I don't know, there are thousands and thousands of children going in for O-level and A-level exams because our own examination boards have been destroyed. And I can understand which parent wants to spoil their child's future. So in that, they don't know nothing about their own history, about their own country. And I think I would like to mention this about China, like whatever China is doing. Over there, it's compulsory for all the children to have 9 years of schooling in their own local system. And now, of course, even they have fallen for the, I would say, the O-level and A-level, because the Cambridge board and all, they're so strong and their influence is there. So they've set up small centers for children to go into their O-level, A-level, because I know Pakistanis who are teaching there in these centers, but the child should have been exposed to 9 years of education in their own language, in their own culture, and whatever they are teaching the children there. I think we should at least have something of the kind. We have asked the Cambridge board to teach the children Pakistan studies, to teach the children Islamiyat, that is there. But we know how much, so many children who plan to go abroad, they don't even take these up. And how the schools teach them, I really don't know. And that is why I say that is dividing the nation, and all this has not been addressed. I mean, by this single national curriculum, they of course say that no, there must be equality and people should be, and there's a lot of talk about equity and egalitarianism, but it is not really there. So that is something which actually needs to be addressed now.
If I might add, I think classroom discourses, and I know Dr. Naureen Durrani has done a lot of work on it, also need to be taken into account now, even more than before, because as you mentioned, ONA levels, and I think Camilla and Anya can also speak to this, we come from that background, but even having that background and being in that classroom of social studies, of history of Park studies, I have heard the same kind of things that I read in those public school textbooks. And that's coming from the teachers who have their own socialization and who have their own backgrounds. Yes, Camilla.
Yeah, I just actually brought it in really nicely. What I wanted to say in all of our discussions today, the big thing that we have ignored is actually the teacher's role in the classroom. Yeah. Ignored in the sense that we were talking about curriculum and textbooks, so it was part of it. But you're absolutely right, and I think that the teacher plays such a pivoting role in turning this whole direction, because you can put, and we have a lot of practitioners in our audience, and I've had conversations with several of them, and the teachers can change everything in the interpretation. And like you're saying, so even in the Cambridge system, you had completely different content, and then the teacher sort of gave their own interpretation. It almost links with everything that we've talked about. We're talking about Zubeida Appa's talking about language. We can teach regional languages, but you still need teachers to teach those. You need teachers to teach English as a subject. You need teachers to teach, how they interpret math, and so it comes in every aspect of the learning. And I mean, I know this is known knowledge to all of us here, but I thought it was important to actually say it explicitly, so in the context of everything that we've been talking about.
100%. And in fact, whenever I am asked to choose one area that I would select as requiring prioritization by Pakistan, my immediate and consistent response is teacher development. And that is not just your pre-service and your in-service, but it is how are you incentivizing teachers as a country? How are you incentivizing it as a profession? And how are you then incorporating pedagogical abilities as well as capabilities for critical thinking, which, is a term that we throw around, but on average, our teachers are not afforded the agency to be critical thinkers, and therefore they do not believe it is their duty to enable that in their students. It is, Kamala, I could not agree more. I think it can be the game changer. But yes.
Sorry, one last one in relation to what you just said. I think that the teachers and students and the whole educational community is controlled through the centralized exam. Even if there's a teacher who wants to teach against the text or who wants to subvert the text in pedagogy, as we say, that either pedagogy can realize the text or it can subvert the text. So even they can't be independent, because the children are going to fail if you don't teach them, if you don't make them rote learn everything in the text and then reproduce it in the centralized exam. The teachers are going to fail, and then they're going to be thrown out for doing a bad job. So there is this massive control over how knowledge is produced, how it's disseminated, how it's packaged and disseminated to people. And if there wasn't this control and the teachers could have their own independent evaluation of their classrooms, of their students, then there wouldn't be this thing about only upholding the curriculum or realizing the curriculum. The curriculum could be subverted in pedagogy. So that is, I mean, our centralized exams, independent external evaluation systems really kill any spirit of critical thinking. Neither the teachers nor students are free of it. Not even principals or,
Dr. Saigol, if I'm, oh, sorry.
Just going to say, building on that, because obviously we don't have enough time. If there is one solution, or if not even a solution, the one way forward that you would think would kind of help us in dealing with this problem of otherization, which is not even recognized by the policymakers, what would you say it would be? And this is a question for all of the panelists.
Well, Naureen, you go ahead.
Go ahead. As Rubina and Camilla has very explicitly evidenced, there is an ideology to present things in that way. So it's not that it is somehow naive or you know, textbook writers are censored, explicit guidelines are presented. So first of all, it's not a matter that they don't know that textbooks are otherizing, but you know, first of all, textbooks need to present an egalitarian order of society explicitly. However, you know, we have seen in Pakistan how matters become very political. So even when there are people who are willing within the curriculum personnel, I had personally conversations with people in the syntax book board, and their ideas were quite progressive in terms of gender. But then everything becomes politicized. The politicians are on the street, the mullahs are on the street, civilians are on the street, and then things take a backstage. Teachers can also be very helpful, but you know, just training them in pedagogical sciences would not solve the matter. Teachers are from our society. They are gendered. They perpetuate these otherness like ourselves. We also do it. And until teachers are encouraged to reflect on the ways teachers perpetuate injustices in the class, in everyday practices, it's not very easy. What I'm saying, it might be easy to teach a teacher how to teach language, but unlearning gender, unlearning your religious identities or what you have absorbed from the entire society, I don't think that that's going to happen with the kind of teacher training that we have.
Just one comment with regard to this, what we are just now discussing, agreeing completely with Naureen Durrani. I want to add that drawing upon the work of famous educationists like Basil Bernstein and Michael Apple and all, who have worked a great deal on class and education, as long as the society and the state are classed, as long as you live in a class society, you cannot declass, you cannot give education as critical, that's different, because what the dominant ideology keeps getting reproduced. I mean, we have the famous book by Bowles and Gintis, Schooling in Capitalist America, which is about the correspondence between what is taught in schools and what is taught at what is required at work. So drawing upon the work of Apple and Bernstein and all, my contention is that as long as we remain a class society, strongly classed society, and as long as we remain a society divided on ethnic grounds and provincial and regional grounds, we will reproduce those same ideologies. For example, the notion of the traitor and the martyr. These are two notions on which nations depend. Nations construct themselves on the basis of the martyr, who's the ultimate good hero who gives his life for the nation, and the traitor, the Mir Jafars and the Mir Qasims, who constantly and perpetually destroy the nation from the inside, eat up the nation from the inside. In Pakistan, we love creating traitors. We are creating new traitors by the minute. And we also have the concept of traitorhood and treason in our constitution. And that is what textbooks do very well. They create the Mir Jafars, Mir Qasims, and then later on Mujibur Rahmans, and later on. So anybody who disagrees with the state or with the power. So my contention is, as long as we have our education is under the national narrative, national security narrative, and as long as our society is so utterly classed, we will not be able to bring an educational system that exists outside of class or outside of national ideology. I mean, people may disagree, but that's what I think.
I feel like this webinar needs to be 4 hours long. So if that is something you are all interested in, it's completely possible. Please just write to us and we will request these unbelievable women to give us 4 hours at least. I apologize. I'm going to have to put a halt to this. It's 6 minutes past the hour. We're 36 minutes over time, happily so. We've had most of our attendees stay. engage. And actually, it's a rare type of engagement we've seen with researchers and practitioners bringing in that insight that is very firsthand to them. So thank you to the participants, and thank you to this esteemed panel. I need to look up synonyms for esteemed because esteemed is not doing justice.
You have to say esteemed panel and Camilla, because I'm not esteemed at all.
You are absolutely, Camilla, you underestimate your contribution. We will work on that separately. But to all of you, thank you. And if any of you or all of you, it sounds like you are researchers and practitioners very dedicated to education, I would encourage you to visit our website, and I've put that in chat, because you might really benefit from being part of a global community. Kamala is part of it, Laraib is part of it, Marvi is part of it, Neha is part of it, and we come together to have similar discussions that are very pointed and in depth. And in fact, I will be reaching out to each one of the panelists today to have you come and speak to us in greater depth. With that, thank you. Please stay safe. I hope COVID never sees light of day in your families or in your loved ones. And we look forward to transforming what we value in education together as a collective community. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone.
Thank you, Anya.
Thank you very much.
It was great.
And thank you, Larry, for co-hosting. You were absolutely splendid.
It was a fangirl moment for me. It was like, you know, like you write something, you read someone's work, and suddenly you're speaking to them. So
They're right here. They're right here. They're right here.
It's time for
In
me
fact,
also, which is why I'm having a serious imposter syndrome sitting on
I think
this panel.
I somehow by mistake even wrote in the chat that can't believe I'm interacting with them. So that's very embarrassing. I was supposed to send it to Camilla. I just sent it to everyone that I can't believe I'm interacting with them.
In fact, can I actually request the band if we can just stay and I can take a picture of us, if that's okay with everyone? Okay, thank you. Larib, I'm loving the fangirling. It's really, it warms the heart. Okay, wonderful. I'm gonna do this now. So 1, 2, and 3. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone. Please stay safe and thank you for your time. Khudafis. Bye-bye.
Thank
Lovely to
you.
meet everybody.
Khudafis.
Khudafis. Thank you. I'll message you.